by Councilmember McCutcheon. Is there a second for the approval? Made by Councilmember Edens. Any discussion on the minutes at all? Okay, well, all in favor of approval of minutes, please say aye.
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 Any opposed?
Aye.
Any opposed and any abstains? Okay, also, I apologize, but we've got some, first of all, we have Mr. Brown joining us tonight, which is fantastic, to the Erosion Task Force. And secondarily, we've got some new members joining us. So we've got Dan Ron. I hope I'm not butchering your last name. Perfect. And we've got some second time meetings members here as well. We've got Mr. Jones, and happy to see Ms. Donaldson and Mr. Berger and Mr. Patton back on the call. So thank you guys all for joining. I can't wait to put you guys to a lot more work as we move forward after tonight. So do we have any public comment cards?
No, sir.
Okay, well, do we want to ask if our two members, it looks like Ms. Vedvik and the other number I don't recognize, do we have anybody that would like to make any public comment, at least from our attendees?
I would ask that if they could use the raise hand feature so that we can bring them in. I don't see any. Okay, then we will move on. So next up on the agenda is going to be a wrap up of the Boy Scouts training and field work. Mr. Archeski, do you just want to mention a little bit about what that event was? Because you were an active participant and it was really well received.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, I think we had over 70 scouts out there with their families. It went real well. Dr. Hammer is also online here too, so he can interject any additional things. But basically, Dr. Hammer talked about what the Boy Scouts were supposed to do, which was go out and measure the detention ponds, the width and the height, the length, and take 5 pictures of the detention pond. We went into a small creek tributary in Babbler Park. We pointed out some good attributes of this creek and gave them some information on possible bad points they'll see and encouraged them to go out and see Cox Creek. But overall, I think it was well received. I'm not sure how much data we've gotten back. Kathy could probably interject on that. Dr. Hammer, do you have any addition?
I do not. Nothing of consequence. I think I would add, though, that one of the things we hope to acquire from this interaction with the Boy Scouts was getting some parents on board and informed, and a lot of them showed up and they were attentive, they were engaged. So I think we accomplished that objective too.
You know, and I can tell you, you know, Miss Eden, Councilmember Edens, myself, and Councilmember Garitano were there. I think the work that Dr. Hammer and Mr. Archeski and Mr. Vunich did in preparation for this event, when you saw the event, and Ms. Arnett, it was really remarkable. These kids really responded to the teaching that they received from Mr. Archeski and Dr. Hammer. But Ms. Arnett could comment on this, but I mean, we've probably received what, close to 60 or so emails, if you are maybe a little under that, with pictures of these detention basins. I mean, it's truly impressive the amount of data that at least was collected. Now, I guess the big question from that is going to be, Dr. Hammer, I don't know if you had a chance to look at some of that pictures, but I'm curious to see what your thoughts are after at least viewing some of it.
I'm impressed. They did what we asked them to do. We've got a lot of information at our hands, and there's going to be a substantial volume, I think, that we can retain in most storm events that we have not been utilizing to this point, and that'll certainly help in the long run. So I'm really happy that the way it turned out. The Scouts did a magnificent job. Most of the photographs I've looked at are good, and so we got a real good idea what shape those detention basins are in.
Ms. Arnett, would you mind can we make that 314 number? That's Dr. Rambo, who's needs to be promoted to panelist. Mr. Vunich, what are your thoughts from the detention basin pictures and that event? I'm curious to see, since you've got expertise and you've been here since the beginning.
Well, certainly, like I think the council persons, I was impressed by the turnout. I was there for at least 5 or 6 of the orientations and the trip into the small tributary that Mr. Archeski described. And I really appreciated the questions from the parents more so, I think, in some regards, because they were interested and wanted to know more. And that's the people we need to help us kind of sell the stormwater park sales tax eventually, because they seen it firsthand now and have walked the walk. So a very positive experience, and thanks to all those that arranged it here on staff, as well as the council persons and Ken McGowan with the Boy Scouts. Thank you.
And thank the Dr. Remy for bringing thermometers. That was helpful. And the city for supplying the shirts. I did have one question though. How are we handling the retention ponds, such as like Lake Chesterfield, Copper Lakes, those that have areas that are full of water? How are we measuring them, or are we measuring them?
Mr. Archeski, as part of the packet for tonight's meeting, you'll see a grouping of 11-inch by 17-inch sheets. That's the work that the consultant's been doing for the city. The consultant has, for the most part, inventoried as many of the detention and retention basins as they could find and discover. I've noticed a couple are missing, and I'll correct that as we go through it ourselves. But the nice thing about these is that with the retention basins, we now have an aerial photograph. We have that aerial photograph in context of the surrounding lots and common ground areas. Along with that, we have topographic information, which is always essential to doing some analysis. But the thing you don't see is kind of the behind the scenes or the backhaul. And each of these basins now has a plat or a site development plan that they basically obtain from the recorder's office. So we know a lot more information about the easements associated with it, the size and the normal pool elevation, things along those lines. And then finally, also the plats and site plans give us dates so we can make determinations. Was this done under MSD's old standard or new standard? And if so, we know if we have probably a problem or a solution. And then finally, just with all that information in conjunction with the Boy Scouts now, we can integrate it all because it's on a database. And that's what the Watershed Erosion Task Force wanted at the end of the day, the start of an electronic database to help us make decisions.
I know some of the subdivisions, such as Copper Lakes, really don't know what the depth of their detention ponds are because they're so silted in. Now, do we have original maps, drawings showing what they're supposed to be?
We do now as a component of the effort by our consultant. We also, in our Department of Public Works with Dan Rand and Rick Brown, we have the original improvement plans, the construction drawings for a lot of these. Now, saying that, that'll tell us what it was supposed to be constructed at, but we know for all intents and purposes, it's probably not like that now. But we can always have that starting point where we need to be and work toward it.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Dr. Ramy, thanks for the opportunity to speak.
No, I think it's great. I think the other thing that's really remarkable, and I'll just underscore the same point that was already made. I was struck by talking with just a number of different parents who didn't really understand the gravity of the situation that the city is currently under. And I think that certainly was eye-opening. And when brought up to them about the opportunity to have further education, they said, 2 people actually said, you know, hey, I'm appreciative that I'm doing this with my child, but I think I want to know more about this because I didn't realize it was this much of a problem. And I've received 1-2 comments since then. After the experience with going to the detention basins, people are now looking at their creeks as they drive down Strecker or Clayton or other roads and I think struck by the gravity of the problem. So I think this worked out pretty well. I think this is a good opportunity for community engagement, and I think that the Scouts and probably others would be interested in perhaps another opportunity to do such, and whether that's assisting with some of the clean out of the Cox Creek and Bottom Creeks and those sorts of things in the future, or other opportunities. I think if nothing more, the work that this group did plus the opportunities in the future, I think are going to be certainly a strength for this task force. Any questions about this? Okay. And if you didn't get a chance to take a look at the PDF that's been put forth by Ms. Arnett and Mr. Vunich, it's really remarkable, at least the breadth of what's been already collected. So next up, Mr. Vunich, would you mind just discussing a little bit about the engagement of consultant to complete the financial calculations, and or Dr. Hammer after that?
Yes, sir, I'd be glad to. So we do have a new face on our Zoom screen tonight, and that is Jonathan Jones. If he'll wave his hand so everybody can see him, there he is. Mr. Jones has worked with the city of Wildwood previously. That work was done on our cut bank at Strecker Road, as well as our living wall over by Point Clayton subdivision. Mr. Jones hails from Colorado, and I've been told that when it rains in Colorado with dirt terrain and mountains, it can be a really wild scene. So we thought we had a good person to help us, and that proved correct in the two efforts he put forth in Wildwood. So before I go into Mr. Jones and what the department has been asking him of late to consider, I do want to note that Dan Rand, our assistant city engineer, if he'll wave his hand since there's no name by him, he is on a stormwater task force, municipal officials, if I'm describing this wrong. And so he's a great resource internally, as well as obviously our Director of Public Works, Rick Brown. So Mr. Jones was recommended by Dr. Hammer and the Department of Planning. And I sent over to him a contract the other day. We're working through some of the details, but it would be the intent of the department to have Mr. Jones, Dr. Hammer, and our public works people work together to develop as scenarios for the restoration or repair of our critical locations, and more so for Mr. Jones to come up with some cost estimates based upon his large degree of expertise in this area. So per the direction of the task force, we have our second consultant that's an engineer, has worked extensively in karsted regions down in the Springfield, Missouri area. And with that, I'll let him do his own introduction. I kind of stole some of his thunder, but I'll turn it over to him with your permission, Dr. Remy.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Jones, and welcome.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I wonder if Dr. Hammer, would you like to say anything before I speak for a couple of minutes?
I don't want to steal your thunder. I'm just really happy that you're here, John.
Well, I'm very honored to be here. I just wish that all of us could be in person as opposed to doing this virtually. Yeah, these meetings are getting harder and harder, I think. I actually just finished, interestingly, testifying in a federal court trial just less than a month ago. The whole trial was virtual. And my testimony went, the judge told me my testimony lasted 7 hours and 26 minutes. And it was all on the screen. It was very difficult. But anyway, I'm very honored to be joining you for the meeting and appreciate the opportunity to visit for a few minutes. We were privileged at the company where I work, called Wright Water Engineers Incorporated. That's WRIGHT Water Engineers. We're based in Denver. And we did work with David and Joe and Ryan Thomas and some outside consultants like Intuition and Logic previously on a number of different assignments, as Joe pointed out. Joe, you might remember that we actually looked at Ryan's request at your storm drainage criteria. And we certainly worked on Cox Creek. And as Joe mentioned, worked in a significant way on the stabilization of Cox Creek at Strucker Road and evaluated the living wall, although we did not design that, and looked at the creek more broadly. Spent a lot of time in the creek with Dr. Hammer and others, and looked a bit at the overall watershed, because of course the ultimate driver here is the runoff from the watershed that goes into the main stem and the tributaries, and is contributing to the problems that you're experiencing. I have worked at our company for 40 years. I'm a registered professional engineer in 19 states, including Missouri. We've been privileged to work all over Missouri. I think it was Joe who mentioned that we've done a lot of work for the city of Springfield and Greene County and the Watershed Committee of the Ozarks on projects involving issues like this and related projects, and then elsewhere around Missouri. And in terms of river morphology and stream characteristics like this, we always think in terms of hydrology and sediment transport and hydraulics and water quality, and then of course the biological side. Our company does a lot of work in those areas. In fact, we have two fellows that, and David and Joe, you don't know this because this has happened since we worked for you guys a while ago. We actually have two staff that work full-time on stream and river restoration. So the kinds of things that your committee has been focused on, like flows and forces and bar formation and erosion and vertical bank formation and how you might arrest that. We're doing work of that kind on many projects at any given time. Dr. Hammer was nice enough to share with me the excellent recent work that he has done. And I have had very little time to look through that this afternoon, but I've skimmed through it. It looks like you're gathering a lot of excellent information. I know as a committee, you've been wrestling with the big questions of why the situation seems to be getting worse, what factors are causing that, what are the consequences of the exacerbated erosion that you're seeing, how would those problems be prioritized, what are the options for dealing with those problems, what would the implications be of implementing solutions in given locations to the stream elsewhere. That's one thing you really have to be careful of in a dynamic stream like this. When you armor one location to arrest the erosion, then something starts happening upstream and downstream. So you really have to look at the stream as a system. And then of course, once you settle in on potential solutions, and this is where I think we might be able to help you if we're lucky enough to be retained, what would the cost of those solutions be? And when we're thinking about costs, of course, we always think about not only capital costs, that is construction costs, but all the costs that go along with that, engineering, permitting, construction observation, and then the follow-up costs. That would be operation, maintenance, and replacement. Dr. Ramey, that would be a very brief introduction. And the main thing I'd like to convey is we were honored to work for the city of Wildwood before and would be quite honored to do so again. And even if we aren't retained, it's fun to see all of you and to realize you've got an up and running committee in the subject area. That's a great way to approach the problem you're dealing with.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? If not, I have a few, but wanted to first open it up to the group. So Mr. Jones.
One quick.
Oh, sorry, Mr. Archeski.
You know, what additional data do we need that we're not collecting right now?
Mr. Archeski, That's a great question, and one we need to think about carefully. And I'd really need to speak with the Public Works Department and Planning Department and Dr. Hammer about what data have been collected since we were last there. You know, have cross sections changed over time? Aerial photos, mapping, hydrology, changes in discharge locations. Dr. Hammer was describing how at critical locations I've seen previously, the bars have actually elevated, and they seem to have become even sturdier than they were historically. And then at the outer banks, we've seen more cutting. So to simply answer that, data regarding hydrology, hydraulics, the forces of the flowing water, what we can call tractive force or tractive stress, the ability of the material to withstand those forces, and then putting that all together into some sort of a sediment transport algorithm, and then determining what measures can be used to mitigate that erosion and how they would be designed and what they would cost. And I'm sorry, since I was only called on this literally today, I just don't know what sort of data you have right now.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. I have a couple questions for you. Mr. Sherman, I'll get you up next. So obviously we'll in a few moments after we discuss, we can, I'm sure Joe would probably prefer to entertain a motion for us to move forward with development of a contract, I would assume. But I do have some questions. So everything that you touched upon, factors, consequences, implications, options, those things are obviously vitally important as we approach this issue, certainly. There are some time sensitive things. So if we were tonight to move forward to try to find one way to fund some of these areas, I would hope that you would develop over time a comprehensive phased plan that would be able to address a number of different things that could be phased in over probably many years. But more importantly, in the short term, and I mean short term before this year is over, it would be helpful at least to have some candidate or representative areas that are probably the highest areas to triage or prioritize, and understand at least a cost estimate in relationship to that. Because I think it would provide the public some education specifically on not only is there a problem, it's a significant problem, and it's a very expensive one potentially. And so we would need to at least shore up some funds to be able to do that. I think that's an important thing. I think in us hiring a consultant is just understanding that there's some short-term needs, and then there's definitively some long-term needs, especially in working with Dr. Hammer. And it's reassuring to hear that you plus Dr. Hammer plus Mr. Vunich and a number of the other folks on this call have a couple hundred years worth of experience in a lot of these different areas. That's wonderful to hear. Mr. Sturman, I think you had some questions.
Yeah, first of all, Mr. Jones, you and your firm sound very impressive. My job on this task force is out looking for money, but my background is construction to include a lot of estimating, building, commercial and institutional. But so the way my brain works is I'm thinking, I would tend to look at prioritized areas and view them as projects, individual projects, prioritized, then with the adequate amount of documentation to then be able to, at least if it, the term I would use is maybe pre-construction conceptual estimating.
Yes.
In the building world. And so that you would identify projects, the extent and scope of them, and then documentation that you need. Would they just be for now? I guess, well, they would be conceptual costs you would put together. And as a person looking for money, I've always thought in my mind, we need to have projects identified and what the costs are going to be to have an idea of how much money we need to bring in and an approximate timetable. So that's what I have to ask.
I find myself, Mr. Sherman, agreeing with all that you said, and I'm not quite sure what your actual question is. But I was tracking with you perfectly, and agree that we would begin with conceptual plans and cost estimates, and then as the level of engineering progresses, all the way through final design, the level of the cost precision would increase as well, and the contingency for the cost would correspondingly decrease. But pardon me for not better understanding the specific question.
Well, see, in walking these creeks and thinking of them as a person, just thinking about the construction and thinking about the costs, even though that's not my world in terms of construction, erosion control, to get our arms around reasonable chunks of work and prioritize that have a reasonable amount in that the cost is reasonable, a piece at a time through the years or through time. I've been thinking that's what we need to do. And so my question is that how you would view it and identify it with the help of Dr. Hammer and all the others that have been involved in this process of mapping the creeks?
Yes, that's
Does it
exactly.
still make sense? I mean,
It does.
Make
And
sense?
yes, sir, it does. And I apologize. I should have understood the first time you phrased it. I'm sorry I didn't. But yeah, you're muted now. But I do agree with exactly what you said. And a phased manner of approaching this with the establishment of priorities rather in dealing with individual projects. That's pretty much how most communities have to approach things. You know, in an ideal world, we would master plan, we develop a hydrologic model for the Cox Creek watershed. For different return frequency rainfalls, we'd calculate flows and forces, and we would simulate the effects on the stream of stabilization measures at many places, and we'd prioritize those. And then we would implement as many of them as we could at one time. But rarely do communities have the money up front to do all that. And what you've outlined is how most communities would approach this, identifying the most significant problem. When we were involved the last time, Wildwood had identified that Cox Creek butting up against Strecker Road absolutely needed to be fixed because the road was actually already overhanging the channel. So there was really no question about the priority there. And defining what the current highest priorities are and then moving ahead on a prioritized manner from conceptual through final. I agree with you. And I believe Dr. Hammer has already done a lot of that work because I think Dr. Hammer has defined 4 high priority projects, if I'm not mistaken. Sorry for the long answer. That was longer than it needed to be.
No, you're good. Thank you.
You're correct, Mr. Jones. Dr. Hammer did identify those. Next up is going to be Councilmember Edens. I have one more question, though, just to follow up first with Mr. Sturman. So in retention of your group, would there be a pre-proposal at least that would define at least what your consulting efforts would at least look like, so we would understand what that process might look like, at least with a pre-proposal? Obviously, it's not defined to the project, but at least we can understand the process by which you would approach after we retain you.
Oh, of course, certainly. You would have to know what we'd be proposing to do. And having not thought about this all that much, but having worked for you before and being, we work all over the United States. I've worked in 40 states, but we are based in Colorado. We would like to, we know lots of excellent engineers in Missouri, and you're lucky to have an excellent consulting engineering community in Missouri. We would actually propose to stay involved working with city staff and your panel almost in an advisory role and an oversight role, and the actual engineering design and construction observation, we would not actually want to be involved with that. We would make recommendations to you for local engineers who could be submitting proposals and fee estimates for you to do that work. We would far rather stay involved in the kind of capacity that we're talking about right now, where we'd be helping you define needs, prioritize scopes of work, helping you send out requests for proposal, evaluating them, and then overseeing the work that Missouri-based engineers would do for you, if that would be acceptable. But Dr. Ramey, the point is, yes, we would need, if you chose to move ahead and had an interest in retaining us, of course, we would have to prepare a scope of work and a cost proposal, and like we do with all of our clients.
Excellent, excellent. I appreciate that. That's really helpful to define. And I think exactly like you delineated, this consulting role is exactly what we're looking for. Councilmember Edens.
I was just wondering in regards to some internal emails that happened before today, Mr. Jones. I had found FEMA restarted a new program that replaced the PDM program called the BRIC program. And their grant deadline is January 29th. So I was just wondering, in terms of a realistic timetable, if we would kind of get that RFQ developed in time and sent out to hopefully get a grant. You know, I'm not an engineer, but I sat through a PowerPoint lecture on it, and it seemed like we had a pretty good shot. And certainly compared to other stormwater management products that had received funding under that program. So that would be the kind of timetable that I would hope to be on, and having those big ticket items identified first. If possible.
If you do choose to retain us, and if I could trouble you to send that information to me, the key will be what level, and this goes to the question that Mr. Sherman posed actually, and that is the level of design or level of planning that FEMA would require for the grant application. If it were conceptual in nature, you know, master plan level, January 29 certainly would be feasible. If they needed the city to go beyond that, you know, with actual construction documents and detailed plans, between now and January 29, that would be very ambitious.
Okay. Would you include your email in the chat feature for the committee, and I will forward you the stream of emails with the grant link so you can take a look at it.
Sure.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
And Joe has it as well, in case I don't know how to use the chat
okay.
feature.
Okay, well then we can certainly get it from Joe as well. But
well, let's see if this will work. Jones. Hang on just a sec.
Okay, but it sounds like regardless that the master plan certainly is the bare minimum priority this winter, and then see what we can't do for that January.
Usually for FEMA, can you see what I just typed?
No.
Maybe Ms. Arnett could help me. I just used the chat feature and typed in my email. Do I have to hit enter?
Yeah.
You can tell how advanced I am.
There you
I'll
go.
take care
You're
of it. I'll take care of it, Mr. Jones.
Isn't that something?
So, Mr. Jones. Perfect. So, so I think that's great that we've now identified potential metrics, at least in retention, which would include obviously getting some cost estimates of prioritized areas, potentially being competitive for a FEMA project, and then certainly consulting and help with our master plan development. Is there anyone else on the task force that wanted to speak to this, or should we entertain a motion?
Oh, probably you should have me leave the meeting before you'd present a motion. I mean,
Sure.
I'd be more comfortable if I weren't on.
No, I want to see if anybody's got more questions for you before we get there.
Great. Could I say one thing? What's very important about all this is the permitting side of this, because before you'd be able to go out in the channel, based on our experience, you know, you'd need to talk to entities like the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, of course. And I'm embarrassed. Joe or Dr. Hammer mentioned that someone on the call is currently with the Corps or has worked with the Corps previously.
My co-chair, Mr. Archeski.
Oh, hi, Mr. Yes. Well, you know better than anybody on the call then about 404 permitting. And of course, I know that MSD plays a very important role there. And, you know, the Corps often has referral agencies, and there would be likely a construction stormwater permit from the Missouri Department of Natural Resources. So the permitting side on this, I would think the city would want to be moving ahead with in tandem with the more traditional engineering, just as a suggestion.
Mr. Brown or Mr. Ron, do you have any questions or points to make in regards to all of this? Love to hear your thoughts.
All I would suggest is when you're hiring a consultant, the typical procedure is to ask questions about his qualifications and past project experience. So this is your opportunity to really drill down into Mr. Jones's past history and projects that he might have worked on that might be similar. And I guess I would ask him that question: what similar projects may you have worked on that you could share with the committee that are most similar to what we're doing and what we're experiencing currently in the city of Wildwood?
Excellent question, Mr. Brown. And obviously at the top of my list would be the fact that we've already worked in Cox Creek with Dr. Hammer and with probably your predecessor, Ryan Thomas, to better understand the hydrology and hydraulics and sediment transport characteristics of the stream, and really the unusual nature of a stream that's so dominated by chert. When you look around the country, to find a stream that's so dominated by this particle size and the implications of that is unusual. So we have worked in Cox Creek itself. As I think Joe said in the introductions, we have worked in other karst settings around the United States. In Southwest Missouri, for instance, we've done a lot of work with streams there. We are working right now for an Indian tribe in northern Wisconsin, and there is a major river that flows through their reservation that has very tight meanders like Cox Creek does. And there is significant concern on the part of this tribe about the stream actually, this river actually avulsing through one of the meanders, and that would damage associated infrastructure. So the same kinds of questions that you're faced with there, we're working on right now, although I should point out that the characteristics of the stream channel are much different there. Whereas you have steep, flashy streams with very high flows and rapid acceleration in flows and increases in forces, flashy hydrographs, we don't have that case in Wisconsin. But we have worked, Mr. Brown, on urban hydrology assignments all over the United States for public and private sector clients. We've been very active with the American Society of Civil Engineers in that area. I chaired the committee that prepared ASCE's National Manual of Practice on Urban Stormwater Management. So, and we do a lot of work in streams and rivers specifically. That's a major area of practice for us.
Thank you.
Dr. Hammer, any comments?
Thank you, Dr. Remy. I do have one, well, two. First is, I had a conversation with Mr. Jones this afternoon, and I was struck with his excellent recall of everything he observed when he was here 15 years ago. And one of the questions that came up, which we've discussed previously, is the efficacy of moving this chert around to buffer some of the cut banks that are rapidly eroding now. And he thought that would be an appropriate thing to do in this condition that the stream is now in, and the short amount of time we have to do some of the restoration. It would buy us time. It certainly wouldn't deleteriously affect anything in the stream that we're aware of, although we are always thinking about the stream as a system and what'll happen if we change things. But the stream has been dealing with this horrendous chert load from the very beginning. And so I wouldn't want to propose that we start moving Chert right away because he's planning to come, I think he said, John, early in November. I think we would like to see, for him to see the stream in its current condition before we start doing anything to it. But I think shortly after that, and after we've identified a local engineer to do some of the work, we probably should be pointing our fingers at some of the really serious places we have that we know we can remediate pretty quickly and buy some time. One of them that really pops into mind would be the erosion gully that's coming off of Strecker Road down there by Quathium Farms. That thing, if we have another winter like last, is going to be a major problem when we can put a plug in that pretty easily. And there will be others like that as well. Thank you.
So Mr. Jones, in respect to Mr. Brown's questions, I do have a couple related questions then. What experience in the same similar role in consulting with a city such as this have you guys experienced success in assisting the city in obtaining grant funds? And the second question is with success with development of grant funds, generally, how successful have you as a group been in consulting from afar while working with local construction and engineers? And is that anything of concern for you?
Great, excellent questions. I'll address the second question first, Dr. Remy. We frequently are retained by other engineering firms around the United States to assist them on specialized questions like this. Other engineers are actually a very important client sector for us. We frequently play a supporting role for consulting engineers who are located in other states who are distant from us. And of course, it's becoming easier and easier because of technology like this. So that really is not an impediment, and it's always worked well. And it worked well long before Zoom, actually. We've had lots of good experience actually in Missouri working with different firms. There's so many of you may know, well, it's probably not appropriate for me to name individual firms in this call, but we have done that very successfully in Missouri and adjoining states. As for the second question, I'm glad you've raised that because frankly, there are engineering firms in the United States that really specialize in working very closely with towns to help them go out and raise money. There are very credible engineering firms in the country, and I can refer you to them, that actually fly with their clients to Washington, D.C. and meet with federal agencies like FEMA in response to the excellent question from Ms. Edens to help raise money. Not only with FEMA, but with the Department of Interior and EPA and others. That has not been a practice, honestly, that we have been all that comfortable with. We are engineers and scientists, and we're not fundraisers. And I don't say this with any judgment towards others, but we have really wanted to stay technically focused and produce good engineering and science that our municipal clients are able to present to entities that provide grant money, and we answer their technical questions, and that's sort of where we draw the line. So we have worked with many local governments that have utilized our master plans to obtain money quite successfully, but to actually, the word that comes to mind is lobby for money on behalf of local governments. We just don't go into that area. Now, let me give you one example. And I would be delighted for you to call the folks there in Salina, Kansas. And this goes to a question that Mr. Brown posed. But in Salina, Kansas, the river that flows through that town is the Smoky Hill River. Following the devastating flooding that many of you have read about in 1952 on the Missouri and Mississippi rivers and throughout the central part of the country, the Corps of Engineers, Rick, you'll appreciate this, at the request of the city of Salina, the Corps actually cut the historic Smoky Hill River channel off with a bypass around the city and build a levee. So from 1952 on through the around 2010, when we were contacted by the city of Salina, the old meandering Smoky Hill River channel through downtown Salina, it had no flow in it. I mean, it was a dead channel. And a group of citizens, like the citizens on this call, wanted to bring the channel back to life. So the citizens, get this, the Friends of the Smoky Hill River, they're called the Friends of the River. They have a great website and an executive director now. They actually raised $100,000 and retained Design Studios West and Wright Water Engineers to develop an initial master plan to bring this river, the 7-mile-long river, back to life in downtown Salina. And the city of Salina was so impressed, and ironically, the city manager in Salina is now the city manager in Springfield, Missouri. His name is Jason Gage. Isn't that ironic, given that I'm speaking to people in Missouri? And you should call Jason, he'll tell you the whole story. The city was so impressed at what this citizens group had done that they used the initial sketch level master plan that we had developed with Design Studios West, a guy by the name of Don Brandis, who's been one of the best river restoration landscape architects in the country, to develop a plan that they used to get funding from the city. A very excellent firm, HDR, which many of you are familiar with, picked up on our master plan level work and carried it on, and they've gotten huge grant money for the city of Salina. So again, I probably talked way too much in response to your question, but that's how we would approach the finance. That to me emphasizes the importance of us working with local engineers and others in Missouri who frankly would do a better job of at that for you than we would do. But we would sure give them all the ammunition they need to go lobby for money.
And that's something that you guys have done before. We're certainly working with engineers locally that are successful.
Absolutely. Yep.
Perfect. Any other questions here from our group?
Really appreciate you inviting me to join, and Joe and David, thanks for remembering us after all these years. By the way, I should give credit, you know, Intuition and Logic, based in St. Louis, worked on heavily on that project on Strucker Road. In fact, they're the engineers of record. We were advising them. So that's an important point for me to note.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all very much.
Thank you for coming. And if there's no other questions for you, we'll probably move forward with our next steps.
I'll be better with Zoom the next time.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jones.
Thank you. Great to see you again.
So, Mr. Vunich, how should we approach this? Would you prefer us to think on this, or should we entertain at least a motion for development of a contract and then we can at that point can bring this forward to council?
Well, I would ask the members of the task force if they feel comfortable with engaging Wright Water Engineers Incorporated, specifically Mr. Jones, or if they would like more time to think about it. We could do it either way. Not knowing the extent of his scope of work, we could do a contract for $10,000, which the interim city administrator can sign, or we can wait, get a more robust report in terms of his scope of work, and have it at the next city council meeting. It's really your call.
Mr. Sherman.
I would heavily lean on Dr. Hammer and Joe and the others that have had experience with this firm in the past, and I assume are familiar with their capabilities and the scope of their disciplines and track record and all that. I would lean heavily on that to make that vote on his decision.
Thank you, Mr. Sherman.
Councilmember Farmer.
I think we just need to make the motion to start this thing. I mean, I don't know that waiting much longer and trying to dig through all these details is going to benefit us anymore. I think we need to get moving on this deal.
So do you want to make a motion for what Mr. Winich had mentioned for $10,000 to at least get started?
Yeah, I think I'll make the motion for 10 grand to get started. And then I assume he'll be able to come back relatively quickly with a scope of work and what that might mean. And we can go to the council with that.
Just a point of clarification, does it need to be 10,000 or does it need to be 9,999 so it doesn't exceed 10,000?
It's 10,000, sir.
Perfect. Okay.
What is the 10,000 going to buy? I mean, what's the basic scope of the services?
From the perspective of the department, I'd like to get him in town so he can take the work that we've provided as the task force out into the field with him and begin verifying some of our assumptions, our observations, and then kind of work from there onto that next step, that phasing you described, Mr. Sturman, and then, getting an idea of the components of each phase and working toward that master plan.
Okay, so with Mr. Farmer, Councilmember Farmer's got a motion on the table. I see Ms. Edens and Ms. Oldhouse. Is that to second the motion or do you want to speak separately?
No, speak separately.
Okay, Ms. Oldhouse? Okay.
Speak separately also. I would suggest
Okay,
that.
hold on one second. Hold on. We just have to get a second for the motion. And if there's no second, then then Ms. Edens, then yourself.
I'll second it.
Okay, so now we're just going to have discussion simply on this motion, and then we'll come back after the motion and we can go to Ms. Edens and then Ms. Holdhouse.
I would just feel more comfortable with the scope of work written out. I think just procedurally. I don't want to set a precedent, but I can understand that this would go ahead and cover travel costs to come in, but that's certainly exceeded within that $10,000 range. So if this fails, I won't amend the motion, but I'll make another motion to do the scope of the work first, because the likelihood that this consultant fee, I would expect it to be more than $10,000 in the end. However, if you get a blank check to $10,000, you're going to spend up to $10,000 if you would have done the work for $8,000. I would think. So.
Actually, I would hope not. I think the department would have failed the task force if it brought in a consultant in that's just going to try to pad their bottom line. That was not the case when Mr. Jones was in town previously. I worked on 2 projects that I referenced earlier in the presentation. But certainly, given your concerns, the department would be glad to talk with Mr. Jones tomorrow to expedite the scope of work and then provide that to you as soon as I receive it.
So Councilmember McCutcheon, are you speaking on the motion?
Yeah, yes, I'm just wanted to agree with Councilmember Edens. I think procedurally we're better off going ahead and getting the scope of work before we go ahead and expend any kind of funds.
And just for the task force members, so we'll have discussion on the motion, then we'll vote, and if the motion fails, then we would move forth with potentially another motion or other direction. So just want to make sure everyone understands procedurally how this works. Chair Archesky.
Yeah, Joe, is this similar to the scope of work we had with intuition and logic?
It will be similar, but I certainly haven't provided that to Mr. Jones, and certainly I would not probably provide any parameters. I've given him the general direction of the task force from its inception till today. We provided him background information on the work that's been achieved. I'd rather let him form his own scope of work and not necessarily direct him towards something other than that. So do I expect it to look like intuition and logic? Probably. I mean, they're good engineering firms and they both understand what I would consider the watersheds and the dynamics of watersheds, but I'm not sure what we'll come back with. That's why, quite frankly, I would not recommend approving the motion on the floor tonight, given the concerns of the 2 council people that obviously they're the ones that have to manage the taxpayer dollars. I'll do my best to get the expedited scope of work to you. And if we need, we can maybe consider a special meeting on Zoom to get things moving forward if you're all satisfied.
So just so, Mr. Vunich, just on that point though, if we were to vote this motion down, our next meeting is not until October the 28th, and we're obviously in the midst right now of making budgetary decisions for the upcoming 2021. And so it just falls at a really inopportune time. And so the question then would become, with a month to go, and we will be putting forth some budgetary discretions. And then also we've got the timeliness of being able to develop and work with a consultant so that we can get some information, not only for FEMA, but for honestly, for a potential April vote. Do you think that that's going to be difficult in the next couple of weeks before the 28th, that we'll be able to have something meaningful to vote on?
Good. I think Mr. Jones has a acute understanding of the circumstances in Cox Creek, given his past work. But certainly, I don't think it was intentional, but if you're calling into question the recommendation of the department because you don't have a scope of work and are afraid that money will be spent on non-essential items, I really believe you should not support this motion. I think we need that scope of work, and then we can hold a special meeting of the task force on Zoom, and we could pull that together within a matter of 24 to 48 hours. That's the benefit of Zoom. We can do it pretty much from anywhere with attendance accommodating a quorum. So I guess I'm trying to draw the line here. I just feel the question was at the heart of the issue here. We did a lot of vetting back in 2006. We talked to a lot of different engineering firms across the country. Right water engineers came to the forefront, or to the top of the pile. So let's give Mr. Jones a chance to put his scope of work together, and you all can scrutinize that. I think that's the best approach. Thank you.
So up next will be Ms. Holthouse.
I just wanted, and maybe it speaks to the scope of work that would outline or suggest. It seems like determining if we can get some preliminary, a project plan such that we could apply for grants in January was one critical need I heard. And then it sounds like permitting is going to potentially be a longer lead item even than putting something on the ballot and getting it passed. So to me, maybe just a scope of work that sort of was discovery that would lead to, the plan that would say, hey, here's what we need to do to, we've evaluated these grants and the requirements, and here's the plan to be ready to apply for them. And also an outline of what the timeline for, permitting might look like, so that we can have that coming together with identifying the critical areas and obtaining the funds.
Ms. Holthouse, I'll pass that comment on to Mr. Jones as he prepares the scope of work.
Okay.
Mr. Berger, you're next.
Yeah, my point was just to clarify whether or not this motion was to grant expenditures for Mr. Jones to come out and clarify the scope of work. And is that typical? Because that was my understanding, is that the intent was to just cover some expenditures to come out and get additional clarity on what the full scope of work might look like for a consultancy.
Mr. Berger, I believe that's a good summation. I think all of us at one point or another in the last year have been surprised by the conditions in many of the watersheds. For a long period of time, I think we believed we had arrested the problems by our environmental regulations and other steps that we've taken in terms of density of developments, et cetera. But I don't think there's anybody on the screen that hasn't stepped into the creek and been like, holy cow, how'd that happen? Mr. Jones' references go back to 2006, so now almost 14 years. I think it would be hard to come up with a scope of work, not knowing first and foremost how the watershed, at least in Cox Creek, has changed. And so the intent wasn't to spend the entire $10,000. The intent was to be able to get him in town to see the scale or magnitude of what's changed in his 14 years of being away from Cox Creek. But again, I think we can get a scope of work in a reasonable time frame, the special meeting, and not delay this any more than necessary to address the concerns of our city council members.
Mr. Sherman, you're next.
Yeah, when I seconded, I wrongly kind of felt we had an idea of what that scope would consist of. But I agree with what has been said. We do need to know the scope and have him identify the scope for the 10,000 first. So I guess I'm kind of backpedaling.
Okay, next up would be Councilmember Edens.
I just wanted to reiterate that I'm not questioning the pick of Mr. Jones. I think he'll be excellent, and I trust the department's recommendation on that. I just thought it would be helpful for him. He mentioned that he didn't have a lot of time to review the data that was already collected, so maybe he would feel comfortable with making a scope of work based on having a chance to review Dr. Hammer's report. And if I misunderstand that, then certainly I would feel more comfortable with that in the future. I just, if someone asked me what the money was being spent on, I would just like to have an answer of, besides a flight ticket and a hotel, something more specific than stuff. So that's all I was coming from. I'm not trying to throw a wrench into the system, just having a clearer picture. So I appreciate the pick. I think he'll be excellent. So,
Councilmember McCutcheon.
Yeah, I'm kind of, Councilmember Edens and my thoughts are kind of intertwined there. You know, it's certainly not anything, I trust the department. I trust recommendation. I understand Mr. Jones has worked with the city before, but procedurally, and also the fact that we're spending taxpayer dollars, I really think we need to have a scope of work before we vote for any funds to be spent. And he does have information from Dr. Hammer and other information to look at, and I would think that he should be able to develop a scope of work without actually being on ground. Now that might get amended at some point, but I really hate to spend taxpayer dollars without a scope of work and saying what we're going to be spending that for.
Ms. Clark. Councilmember Clark, excuse me.
No problem. Yes, we're talking about the scope of work, and we're talking about the $10,000, and then we're talking about the scope of this project. So I guess I'm a little confused as to which scope we're talking about. If we're talking about the scope for the $10,000, then I see that, you know, maybe you could put that together quickly, like Mr. Vunich was saying, and we could come back and, you know, quickly and approve that. The scope for the entire project, I think he needs to come in and take a look and really dig in and get a strategic plan, a master plan together, and give us a scope for that project. But for the $10,000, I think we can do it fast and don't need to approve it right now, but we can come back in a couple of days or whatever it takes.
So I'll make a couple comments usually. So I have a dissenting opinion. I actually think that Councilmember Farmer's motion can be interpreted as up to $10,000 and not to exceed certainly $10,000 because that's the limits. And I think that we're in a precarious situation because this is a group that's been well vetted, that Dr. Hammer certainly well appreciates and has worked with before. And we've spoken that this is a group that he has the utmost confidence, and I'll let him speak on that. I think that we're delaying things for no reason. I mean, the scope of work is going to be defined while he's coming out and evaluating the project. This is exactly why we need this now. So I don't really know what you're going to gain in the next couple of days.
This is why we're voting on it. We want to move forward and understand from an expert that's going to provide a proposal for exactly what we're hoping to anticipate. And then, yeah, he'll work from that point on and tell us exactly what it's going to cost for his services to at least evaluate a grander scheme or phased approach for how we'll get there. I don't think that we need to wait any longer. And I mean, we've waited a fair amount of time already. So I don't really anticipate that you're going to see anything in the next couple of days that's going to change the decision to want to move forward with a well-vetted already group anyway. And the amount of money that's been allocated is up to $10,000. So I think that's reasonable for city taxpayer dollars, because we're trying to get to what we need to get, which is to make sure that things like Strecker Road, we don't see things fall into creeks. And that's what's going to happen if we keep delaying things. And I don't think a couple of weeks will change that. But I don't think that changing it's not going to change our decision tonight either. So that's my 2 cents. And Councilmember Clark, you're next.
Yeah, I don't think I was totally clear on what I agree with you, Mr. Remy, that the scope, I'm just looking at the scope of the next, up to $10,000 is something that he does all the time.
Right.
He does this all the time. So he knows what he's going to do. He's going to come in and take a look, and you know, I trust everybody that's in the city that's been planning this and has talked with him already. And we know him already. We know what he's going to do. So I would have to support also Mr. Farmer's recommendation, his motion, because if we come in, that's why I was saying, what scope are we talking about? Because this really doesn't need a formal scope to come in and look it over and build his master plan, his strategic plan, in my opinion, because he's done this so many times. If he was brand new at it, maybe we'd need to know, but I think he probably knows what he's doing.
Dr. Hammer, do you have an opinion on the situation?
I want to be real careful because you're talking city business now, and I don't want to get into that. But I first met John Jones before he worked for Wildwood. The city of Columbia was having some stormwater problems back in early 2001, 2002, I think, and they really made a mess of things. They one of the city council members was an ag economist at the University of Missouri, and he hired his postdoc, who was an entomologist, to be the city's water quality expert. And once they realized they had made a terrible mistake, they did a national search, and they ended up bringing John Jones in. And to his credit, he took one look at what they'd done and said, "You guys got this in such a mess already. I don't know what I can do to help you." And they went ahead and got his advice and were able to move forward pretty quickly from that. I have recommended to him, particularly when I was in federal agencies. I was with the Natural Resources Conservation Service for several years and then with EPA. And he inquired as to my availability to consult with him on several projects. And of course, I couldn't do it since I was a federal employee. So I sent other people that I knew. And to a person, they all agreed that he was one of the most professional and honest people they'd ever met. So I think that the fears that he might abuse a paltry part of $10,000 are misplaced. His annual budget for his company probably greatly exceeds what we would expect. And he didn't get his reputation by playing games with clients. The other point I would make in relation to what you said, Dr. Remy, about getting him on board quickly, and this comes from my experience with federal agencies and also my experience writing probably close to 100 proposals when I was on the faculty at MU. You're probably not going to get a major proposal funded from FEMA the first year. The way these procedures normally go is you do your best, you make your best shot the first year. And his statement about going to Washington and meeting with agency officials is spot on. Anybody distributing funds is going to feel a lot more comfortable distributing them if they have a relationship or a good understanding of the people they're working with. So your first appeal to FEMA will be to let them know the scope of our issues and the commitment we have to resolving those issues and our ability to manage funds wisely. And then you'll learn what they really are looking for. In the second year, your chance for funding goes way up. So the earlier you started on that first meeting with FEMA with something substantive and meaningful, the higher your probability is of getting funds sooner. So I guess my perspective is that all we want him to do is come in and refresh his memory and get some information that would enable him to do the major scope of work. So I agree with you on that, Dr. Remy.
Ms. Arnett and then Councilmember McCutcheon.
Thank you. I would just like to note that the way the policies and procedures of the city are set up is that staff generally has some freedom to, as the hired professionals, to hire and spend up to $10,000. It's approved by the city administrator, which we always bring requests to the committee and all of our committees, all 14 of our committees. We always bring the discussion here, and that's where the discussion needs to take place. But when things are very timely, we always enter into a contract. We already have a contract drafted and we've already had discussions with Mr. Jones, and we've put him in touch with Dr. Hammer to rehash what they've already gone through and discussed and did back in 2006, and to look at the 4 priority locations and to evaluate the 17 other locations of concern. And all of that was sent to Mr. Jones. He's already reviewing it. We already have a contract drafted that provides his specific scope of work. So while it appears to be backwards because we're telling him what we want him to do, that's how this process starts from an administrative perspective. Now, the work that we're doing in these creeks is exorbitant and expensive. And, as we've discussed, likely his scope will be beyond that. But the starting point, frankly, is with staff. And we feel like we can get somebody that we trust, that you all should trust, and that we are doing what's best for the city, because frankly, we don't enter into it lightly. We don't spend money lightly, and we don't kind of just waste taxpayers' dollars. We're trying to keep this committee where it's headed and to get to that finish line that you all want. So that's just my 2 cents.
Thank you, Ms. Arnett. That's appreciated, and you guys are appreciated as well. I appreciate that comment. Councilmember McCutcheon.
I'd like to make it perfectly clear, I'm not questioning the department, and I'm not questioning Mr. Jones or Dr. Hammer or anyone else. What I'm saying is I can't personally or procedurally, I understand what Kathy's saying administratively, but from a procedural perspective, as a council member, I cannot agree with allocating funds for something that we don't have in front of us, for something that we can't explain to the taxpayers and to our residents and our constituents. We need that in writing. We need to see that, I think, before we vote to allocate the funding. Honestly, I'm the dissenting opinion here, and that's what this discussion process is for. But I can't support spending $10,000 without seeing the scope or the contract in writing before I vote on it, because I don't actually know what I'm voting on.
And just for full clarification, just to Ms. Arnett's point, the city doesn't need a vote on this.
No, sir. If there was a city administrator, we could do it administratively and the task force would not see it. That's not the typical way I like doing things.
Sure. Understood.
And as Kathy mentioned, we submit all of our contracts, even those under $10,000, to those people that are benefiting from them, in this case, the task force. And again, I would urge you not to support moving forward at this time. If one council person thinks that we need a scope of work and a contract in hand, then I think that should rule the day.
Councilmember Edens.
I was going to thank Kathy very much for her comment. Now that I know that there has been a contract started and a scope of work started in the background, now I'm okay with it. I just needed to know that he had something in front of him to direct him.
I agree with Laura, Miss Edens. I think we ought to get on with it and expedite it.
If there's no more conversation, if we could do a voice vote, Ms. Arnett, would you mind just calling the roll for voting on the motion by Mr. Farmer, which is to authorize the development contract with Mr. Jones and his firm for up to $10,000?
Would you like me to excuse myself while you vote?
That would be excellent, sir. Thank you. Although it is recorded.
And it's live on YouTube, so he could just
live on YouTube. So just hide your face with your cat.
Councilmember Clark.
Yes.
Member Boykin.
Yes.
Councilmember Edens.
Yes.
Member Sturman.
Yes.
Member Holthouse.
Yes.
Councilmember Farmer.
Yes.
Member Berger.
Yes.
Councilmember McCutcheon.
No.
Member Patton.
Yes.
Member Donaldson. Member Donaldson.
Yes.
Thank you. Co-Chair Remy.
Yes.
Co-Chair Archeski.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Vunich, anything more on that matter as we move forward?
As soon as we get a contract finalized, I'll make sure you see it all, even though, again, it may be signed without necessarily you seeing it, and I'll get you what I can. Thank you.
Would you mind sending out to the task force if we could reach out to Mr. Jones and just ask him if he wouldn't at least provide some of the work that he's previously done, if he's got some sort of portfolio that he could share with us. And then it would be nice if we had some historic reference, if he could present some of the work he's previously done in Wildwood, that would be helpful as well.
Yes, I bumped into his resume when I was trying to find his telephone number. I believe his Vita is about 40 pages long, so I'm sure we can provide whatever he would like.
Sure, thank you. All right, that was great, perfect. Okay, so moving on to the next aspect, we're going to work on, next up on our agenda is accomplishments, items underway in future works, which was a nice dossier, if you will, from Mr. Vunich and Ms. Arnett that delineates these issues. Would you both like to speak on this?
I'll defer to Ms. Arnett on this particular item. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm glad you appreciated it. We thought that you all have been meeting for about 15 months. And I think when we started, we were all unsure on our specific time frame, and we've accomplished much. I think the 9 items that we've accomplished may not have been outlined at the very beginning, and we've kind of gone off on a number of tangents as things have been uncovered for us and discovered. But I think some of the work that we've done has been, you all should be commended and deserve a big pat on the back. So I'll run through them real quick, and if there's any questions, feel free to just give me a stop. But we've already discussed tonight, we've identified the 4 priority locations and then the 17 locations of concern. We've done data collection, the 3 most impacted watersheds. We've done extensive research on available funding sources. Mr. Sturman, I think you get the award for the best job done that resulted in $0. But you've done a yeoman's work. It's just incredible the amount of work that you've done, and I think it should be acknowledged and appreciated. But next time you can get a couple bucks, we'd like it. So
yeah, $0 is no fun though, I'll tell you.
All right. We've recently completed the mapping of the detention and retention basins, which went a step further and gave us some subdivision mapping as well that we it will be helpful for staff in particular. So that's been a great project to work through. We recently completed the training of the area Boy Scouts, and I did include an article that West News Magazine did on that. So I thought that was a great positive promotion of that effort. So job well done there as well. And we have received more than, I think it took 75 emails, Dr. Remy, to get about 34 or 33 basins mapped and identified. So they live in a Google world, so they've had to shift a little bit for Microsoft stuff, but we got all that, and that's going to be great information. And Dr. Hammer and Chris Parker in our office have both been tabulating all of that information. We created the brochure early on that explained what you all were doing, what the task force's work was. It was mailed to more than 800 residents and all subdivision trustees. It's been on our website and available at City Hall back when City Hall was open as well. We have impacted residents, more than 75 residents submitted erosion forms and gave us that information. And then we met with MSD, which will follow up with them. Actually, that should probably be on our future work, is to provide MSD with our final list and areas in hopes that we can get additional projects put on their radar, on their plans. So currently we're working on the review of the city ordinances and regulations. We're working on the public education campaign, including a video series. And then we're working on scheduling a subdivision meeting, 3 subdivision meeting with Land Learning Foundation to discuss that area around Quatham Farm that Dr. Hammer referenced earlier, that meander part through Cox Creek that impacts Point Clayton and Wildwood Meadows. So the department has outlined 5 things that we think that you all have directed as what you want the future work to be. So again, there's questions, but also we'd love input if you agree with those 5, if there's something that we've missed. But those would be to complete the review of the ordinances, create the stormwater master plan, finish the public education campaign with the video series, try and find funding somewhere, whether that's a tax or some other long-lasting and reliable funding source, and then to come up with a maintenance plan for those critical locations. So again, the department appreciates all of your time, all of your work that you've done. It's been a fruitful 15 months, but we know it's a lot of work, and we appreciate all the time and effort that you all have put into this. And would love to hear if we've hit it on the future work, or if you have other ideas that we need to tabulate.
Any comments from Ms. Arnett?
I'll just have one. Thank you for all your hard work and Joe's hard work and the city staff. I mean, you guys do an unbelievable, I know you're sharp employees and everything, so we appreciate it very much.
And I second that.
And you also have to put up with folks that have content expertise and folks like me that don't. And so you're graceful to each of us, and I appreciate that. All right, so moving along with our meeting, next up on our agenda. And so before we tackle the subcommittees, but to parlay from the 5 areas, we've got the stormwater master plan and ordinance review. And so prior to this meeting, we discussed briefly about how to separate at least into these 2 subcommittees, if you will. And we're at the point where we just want to make sure that people that are invested in one or the other committees are on the right respective committees rather than assigning. So if we could, before we start, if this is okay, Ms. Arnett, maybe we could just sort of take a hand raise for people that are interested in each of the committees. And if there are individuals that are interested in both committees, that's certainly fine as well. And then we'll follow this up certainly with our members that are currently missing. So if you wouldn't mind raising your hand if you would like to be part of the subcommittee for the stormwater master plan development. Don't everyone raise your hand all at once.
I'm happy to be on either one. It doesn't really matter to me.
All right, so Councilmember McCutcheon, Mr. Patton, Mr. Berger, and Councilmember Farmer. And Councilmember Edens, perfect. And in full disclosure, remember, if we have consultants, remember, they're going to assist in this one. So that's good. Okay, and in regards to ordinances, who would like to be part of that subcommittee? And I'm going to nominate John Gunther for that one, but he's not on the call today. I'll nominate Councilmember Garitano because he left.
I think Councilmember Rambo was already on that one too, so.
Perfect. So we need a place and a home for, let's see, Councilmember Boykin and Miss Holthouse. I'm sorry, Councilmember Boykin, sorry about that. Miss Boykin and Miss Holthouse. Do you guys have a preference on either?
I'll be on the ordinance subcommittee.
Thank you. And Miss Holthouse.
I'd apparently been unsuccessful at raising my hand for the Stormwater Management Committee.
Oh, perfect. Okay. Great. So you're going to be on the, okay, great. Ms. Clark, Councilmember Clark, you had a question.
Yes, if I was going to be on one, I had my hand up for stormwater master plan, but if you need me on someplace else, I'm happy to go.
Okay. If anybody wants to be on both, just shoot Kathy or Mr. Vunich an email if you don't mind, just so we can include you on those.
Can I ask, I'm missing two that I just, as I was typing, I missed hands up. So Mr. Sturman was one, unless he's staying strong on our finance by himself there.
You're muted, Mr.
Yeah,
Sturman.
I know. I couldn't get it clicked off. No, I'll stick with the finance, go on, but I would be interested in the master plan if there's room. I would be interested in that. But
thank you. And
if wherever else, maybe you would have more need. I'm ready to, help wherever.
And just in full disclosure, I think that your skills with that group, as well as Ms. Holthouse's skills as well, education and finance are going to be relevant parts of that subcommittee. And so there's a way to, I think, build into a lot of the work that you guys have already been developing. Okay.
So where is education going to fall?
So my assumption, unfortunately, it's probably going to be in both committees, but I think at the present time, depending on the timeliness of if we're going to move forward with community education specifically and how to develop this, I think the master plan is probably the most relevant place to start with. While folks are working on ordinances, I think that would make the most sense.
All right. I'm so new to this that I'm trying to catch up and figure it all out. So, and I haven't met any of you in this time of COVID, but then that's where I would probably.
Perfect. Mr. Vunich, do you agree?
Yes, sir. I think the stormwater master plan will probably be the most inclusive of all the two committees.
Thank you.
Okay. So in regards to those two subcommittees, I guess the next question is going to be, what are the next steps for that? And one might assume that the next best step would be to consider, after maybe having an initial meeting, to have them first meet, if that's okay. And we can just have a subcommittee meeting separate from our main meeting, if that's allowed, since we can do this virtually. And in that process, perhaps the subcommittees can come up with the tangible goals that they would expect with advisement. I don't know, Mr. Archesky, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the subcommittee should meet, get some standards down as far as what their goals are. Maybe, 1, 2, 3, 4 priorities, especially for the stormwater master plan.
Dr. Hammer, if we could find time separately for the two subcommittees to meet, would you be able to be present for both of them to provide some advisement?
I'd be happy to do that, yes.
Okay. Any further questions or suggestions regarding the two subcommittees? Okay. Next up on our agenda is other matters for consideration. And I think I just want to revisit my opening comments to see the temperature for individuals, if there's consideration for
potentially putting a stormwater and parks tax on the April ballot. Councilmember Farmer.
Yeah, I mean, I know that you always like when I say this. I still am relatively new around here, so I'm not exactly sure how all of these things work, but maybe Joe or Kathy can help me understand this. I mean, one of the things that's been very rewarding about this specific task force, I think, is the speed at which it's working. And, you know, while I've lived around here for a long time and looking at the creeks, I assume things were pretty bad. I think, as Mr. Vunich pointed out earlier, when we were all down standing in them, it's pretty clear that we've got a really significant issue in some places. So I don't know. I think after, you know, all of the work that Mr. Sturman has done trying to find money, I don't know an alternative other than to put a ballot initiative in place. I also don't know the entire process. I imagine it isn't quick. And so I think we should probably start figuring that out sooner rather than later. Unless it's very easy to do. I don't know. Is it Mr. Vunich or Kathy? I'm not sure.
When the city presented the stormwater and park sales tax in 2008, we had a period of almost 12 months to ramp up to it. First and foremost, we had to start building support amongst the community. Obviously, we weren't successful, but it was key to basically tell people, first and foremost, why we needed it, what we would do with it, and ultimately answer their questions about sunset time, meaning would it be forever or is it a 10-year tax? Things along those lines. Just in terms of practicality, the ballot has to be to the St. Louis County Board of Election Commissioners by mid-January. So for all intents and purposes, we have approximately 3.5 months to formulate the ballot language and try to gain, I guess, some level of support amongst key groups so that once the ballot is filed, they can be out in the community advocating for it, because the city cannot. It can just provide information, but not a position.
Co-Chair Orchesky.
Actually, that was my question. Joe answered it already, when we have to have it, you know, ready for ballot.
Ms. Boykin.
I just wanted to visit from the last meeting that I believe it was brought up, what Joe brought up, that it was on the ballot before. And usually you don't want to go on there if there's going to be a school bond issue, which I understood there was going to be on this upcoming ballot. Am I remembering that wrong? My opinion would be, I think that we want to target for a different cycle than this next one coming up. So we have more time to communicate and we're not competing with the school bond.
Do you think there's any advantage though in a virtual age right now before the virtual sorts of, is there any advantage to doing it sooner than that?
Are you asking me?
I am.
Oh, I'm waiting for someone else to answer. You know what? The only reason I'm on this committee is because I had a big problem with drainage amongst myself and 4 or 5 neighbors. And let me tell you, I'm learning a lot here. And I don't think that anyone in my HOA, I don't think other people in the community are aware of this problem or the scope of it. I think we have a lot of work to do communicating with HOA trustees to help them understand, like, hey, we need your support in educating your homeowners in your subdivisions, and we need your support for this ballot. And I think that we might be shooting ourselves in the foot to go early, and then it gets voted down because there's not enough time to educate people. And then we go put it on the ballot again the next time, and they're saying, oh God, we did this before and they couldn't get it through. So now it looks suspicious when we go put it on again. I just would rather have us in a better position. Now, I'm new to the committee, so I'm asking a question as much as I'm trying to just understand and give my 2 cents at the same time. So
thank you. Councilmember Edens.
One thing that the staff did do that was pretty well attended is we did have a meeting for the trustees and educating them on erosion issues. And we had pretty good attendance. I would have liked to have seen a better turnout. But what I did notice from dealing with my constituents is the knowledge that we gave the trustees stopped at the trustees, that something happened and they didn't tell their residents and their neighborhoods what they learned. And so that tells me we do have a little bit more work to do. I share some of Karen's concerns. I guess my question is for staff. I mean, do we think we can get to the end goal in time? You know, one thing we can do is we can certainly ask residents to go out and talk to their neighbors. And that just requires having a little bit of information and prepping first. But I do know that some of that communication has stopped with what the trustees learned. It never got back to the folks that live there.
Council Co-Chair Archesky.
Joe, do you want to answer that first, or?
I just like to know staff's opinion, and if they've gauged the community differently. I mean, talking to residents' complaints. I do know that I'm very hopeful about the Boy Scouts and their parents. I hope they vote, but I don't know if they do. One thing could be with the bond issue. We might actually we usually get a bump in voter turnout for a bond issue, but people could see it as a slower economic time, and that's just too many things to raise money for. So I don't know.
When the city submitted the question to the residents of Wildwood in 2008, we did a lot of research. We contacted municipalities around us that had been successful and unsuccessful. The overarching response from other municipalities that were successful is that usually when you have higher voter turnout, parks, trails, things like that are more successful. We had the ballot issue on November 2008, a presidential election. There were 19,000 votes cast regarding the sales tax, 10,000 against, 9,000 for. It was by far the largest amount of votes ever received by a Wildwood issue, including the incorporation. So from that perspective, we got a lot of turnout. We also considered the municipal election, and there were concerns voiced by elected officials at that time putting a tax issue on a municipal election when 8 council people would be running for either election or re-election. We also looked at the special election cycle, which can be June and August and February. And what we found there is there's different percentages required for the matter to be approved. And it's just, again, a quirk of the state statute. So I guess what I'm saying is I concur with Ms. Boykin. It took us a long time to kind of reach out to a lot of different subdivisions, a lot of different constituencies. For example, we could sell it to some as a stormwater tax. We could sell it to some as a park tax. Having Pond Athletic Association part of Wildwood, having them out there advocating for their parents and children as a benefit to not only the parks, but to stormwater where they're next to Bottom Creek. So I don't know, I just see it as we put the question in 2008. It's been 12 years. We've been hesitant to do it. If we do it again, I think we should be assured that we've basically covered every possible avenue to get support in the community before we take the guess, so to speak.
And just to follow up on that question, is there anything with the county that if we essentially pay to put it on the ballot, and as long as the ballots haven't been printed, that we could consider that a deposit and postpone the ballot that we put it on? So let's say we decide in January that we really aren't going to be ready for April. Is there any kind of thing we can do with the county so we don't waste money?
I don't know, and I will certainly, Kathy or I will contact the Board of Election Commissioners, but I know like for a candidate that you can't remove a candidate's name unless a judge does it. So it's a big deal once the ballot is printed. So we'll find out and we'll send you an email and let you know.
Okay, and maybe what we can talk about doing next time is if we're going to make a drive for this, and I would like sort of a checklist that we can assign all the council members, you know, not just on this committee, but, you know, go through list, making sure we talk to every HOA, making sure we designate volunteers too, because we don't, again, use city resources to advocate for ballot measures, but to simply go door to door and talk about why these issues are important. I think that's the only way we can do it, is if we have an actual regimen. And I think it's doable.
One thing though, can I just throw out to this group? One thing that's different than 2008, good and bad, as we all know, unfortunately, is exactly what we're doing right now in a virtual meeting like this, where if you plan multiple virtual meetings and invite different members of different subdivisions, invariably you're going to get a fair amount of people over a couple of months that are going to contribute and understand what's going on in education. The second point I would make is that, good or bad, social media since 2008 has had a significant impact on, people make their living, as you all know, as quote unquote influencers, which is baffling to me that they make as much money by influencing other people. But frankly, in a short period of time, things can go viral in days. It doesn't take nearly the same time that it did in 2008. And so I guess the bigger question is, in educating the public, I think education in some ways is actually going to be accelerated than in our previous experiences. But I think the bigger question, and I don't know that anyone's really going to have an answer, but I certainly would love to hear, is when do we think this would be most successful? Because once we put this on the ballot, and let's say it is successful, there's still going to be somewhat of a delay before funds are going to even start to accrue. And so theoretically, if it was in April, I would assume that we would not see a percentage of that funds in a meaningful fashion from today, well over 2 years, I would assume. Does that seem right, Mr. Vunich, or am I overestimating the time delay?
I think it's overestimating, but it is a protracted period. I want to say it's anywhere from 8 to 12 months. Again, I'll have to refresh my memory and let you all know.
To your point, Dr. Remy, about council members could do virtual meetings within, their wards. And it could be whether it's, their normal meetings that they have once a year or whatever, to bring up this point. The other thing about delaying, we may return to a point of somewhat normalcy. So we'll have more community activities. We'll have the Lawn and Garden Show. We'll have Celebrate Wildwood and other things throughout the summer that we may be able to get more people involved in.
Councilmember Clark.
Thank you. I just have a question for Kathy and Joe. Do you have a suggestion for getting the word out to wards like Ward 1 and Ward 6, where we have a lot of people that are not in subdivisions and HOAs? And even the places that we have older subdivisions, the HOAs are not registered with the city as, with all of the list of their trustees and all. I know that mine just recently realized we weren't. So do you have a suggestion for us to get that word out?
I'll let Kathy talk about social media and the website.
Well, again, social media in our area is a problem too because of the internet issues.
And again, all the city can do is provide information, not a position. It's prohibited under state statute. So all we would be doing is talking, for the most part, about the level of problems, the cost to correct the problems, but we certainly couldn't advocate one way or the other.
Councilmember McCutcheon.
So from past experience, I agree with Joe. It probably takes a good year for us to educate the public properly in order to get support for it. When we tried to do the sewer lateral tax initiative, we tried to get it pushed on the ballot in April, and it was way too soon. It was complicated. People didn't understand it. I also agree with Mr. Bunich's comments regarding which ballot to put it on. That's tricky as well. But I think it behooves us to really take the time to educate our public on this issue. It is an important issue. And I think you do need to do a two-pronged approach, one for, the parks and then one for stormwater, because again, what is going to impact one resident may not be as important to another resident. So, and I think if you're going to do a two-pronged approach, it's going to take you a little bit longer than if you were just advocating for one area versus the other. But having been involved in other activities such as this, it really takes a good deal of time to educate the public. And I think we should do it well. Since we've spent a lot of time on the task force, we're going to continue to spend a lot of it. We've got a lot of good information, but we really need to share it with the public.
So Councilmember McCutcheon, would you recommend or even make a motion for us to consider August of 2021 so we have at least a goal?
Would I make you're looking for a motion?
Correct. Because we need to have a goal, right? If I can't make motions, but if I would think about April, but I'm okay with August. But we need to have some sort of directive. We just can't continue to educate without actually putting something there. And Mr. Sturman has done his work, and there's just not money. And I've married for love, not for money, so I don't have a rich wife. So we're stuck with other opportunities. So I think, unfortunately, we're going to have to come to a consideration of how are we going to approach this? And this seemingly is the only real way. And so I think it's unfortunate that we'll have to educate folks, because I think people will get it. I do think that erosion is probably going to be more important in 2020 than it was in 2008 on mines. And our parks certainly have been fantastically developed, but we need to have we need to know where the touchdown's going to go. And if it's not going to be in April, is it going to be August? And we should probably define that now so we can move towards it. Councilmember Eden, sorry.
If we do it in August, we don't have a year to at least do that. I don't know. Mr. Vunich, do you think that's possible, August?
The department was going to recommend August or November of 2021.
See, my preference would be November 2021. I think that gives us a more adequate amount of time to promote the idea.
Okay, I think it's really far away, 14 months, but I understand, I respect what you're saying. You've been through this before. Councilmember Edens.
I was just going to say, maybe since we still have a little bit of time before we have to start using the ballot language
right,
as printed, or the date for which the vote is going to be. So I think we can still continue, like the steam train is rolling down the hill and picking up speed, and let's find out if we can ever withdraw something on the ballot and kind of put some money down in advance. But otherwise, I think the department's right on, and we'll have to plan for the fall, following fall. But there's no reason why we can't continue speed.
Mr. Berger.
As if it was the date.
Sure. Mr. Berger.
Yeah, I do agree that while 14 months may seem like a long time, there is a lot of work that needs to be done to get this thing shaped up and in order. And I could imagine we would leverage every bit of time that we have to get that done. And maybe this is a little off course. This is my first meeting, but I am curious about, obviously anything is going to take a bit of a longer term horizon, but for those residents who have a pretty immediate and concerning issue, is there anything to be done in the nearer term for that? Or is it just kind of sit on your hands and participate in the process and hope that we can get things moving? Or what does that look like?
Well, this would be an argument one might argue to try to accelerate the process, not to delay it. Because in looking towards 2021, the projects that we might triage are probably going to be in and around related to infrastructure for the city. not necessarily areas that are going to affect private citizens, but there may be some benefit to attacking some of those problems. But until we get the consultant in to be able to really evaluate those processes, it's going to be exceedingly difficult to get there. I don't know, Mr. Vunich, is that what your thoughts are?
Well, Mr. Chair, to respond to Mr. Berger, as Mr. Jones mentioned, just in terms of the permitting process and the development of engineered plans, that's going to take a bit of time, months in fact. So what I would like to say to Mr. Berger is, if we know our priority locations, we could actually start that permitting and engineering process so that we could have something to show people that what we're doing, we would be using our time well. And then whenever the vote was taken, August or November, we would be in a better position. So I guess what I would say is we wouldn't necessarily stand down. We'd start actually doing the foundation work, so to speak, so that if the tax was approved, we're in a position to move right away. I would also say that prior to COVID-19, we were hoping as a task force to put aside money in the capital improvement program for 2021 to help with, let's say, lesser issues in the creeks, those that may be impacting areas around private properties. And certainly any problem in the creek, we would always contact MSD to make sure that maybe it's one of those things that we could get them to fix. You never know. It's always worth asking.
Mr. Vunich, quick question for you in regards to what you just said, and then it goes to Co-Chair Archeski and then Councilmember Farmer. As you're developing budget for next year for 2021, are you anticipating a project or two that are relevant to infrastructure that will include erosion to include in that budgetary process?
That's my hope. If Ms. McCutcheon gives me the floor at the Planning and Parks Committee, I'll be making my pitch.
Perfect. Thank you. Sorry, Co-Chair Archeski.
You've got it, Mr. Vunich.
Thank you, ma'am.
No, and Joe brought up a good point about private property, because until we get funds that we can use on private property, we can't fix many of the problems that are out there now.
Councilmember Farmer.
Yeah, Kathy or Joe, what if any is the city or members of the task force or whatever? I mean, obviously getting actual polling data is incredibly expensive, but we could do a relatively unscientific version of that and see where the knowledge rank is for people. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of Nextdoor and all of the social media stuff that normally goes on, but I think in this case it could be used very much as the tool it's designed to be, to get people the information they need by asking them questions to understand what it is they know that is going on. In my normal job, I get paid to change people's minds pretty quick. So 15 months is, I could change somebody's mind 1,000 times between then and now. I don't think it's that difficult to do, especially when it's a real problem and it's pretty visible. You drive down Strecker Road, you put a sign out there that says, hey, this time next year, this road won't be here. That'll probably change some people's minds.
I'm sure Mr. Brown and Mr. Ron would not want to do that. So I understand your point. And prior to 2008, we did a statistically valid survey of Wildwood residents, 3,000 households. That's how we built the consensus that the park sales tax might be successful based upon the responses. So I'm sure we could do some kind of survey to ascertain, and I'll let Mr. Brown finish.
Thank you, Joe. I'm not necessarily volunteering to do it, but I was going to point out with our deer management committee, we did that survey last wintertime online and tried to use that as a tool to educate and then get feedback from residents about the deer problem. And I was thinking there might be a similar approach here where you tried to put together a survey and we publicized it through social media. We had about 1,000 people respond to it, which I thought was pretty good. And it costs us very little to do it. And so we might want to think about something like that.
So just because I'm appreciative of the time and I respect Councilmember McCutcheon's chairing of her committees where she ends it exactly at 2 hours. And so I don't want to go over either because I think that's brilliant. Would it be acceptable to this group that over the next couple of weeks, we develop at least an email chain about perhaps ways that including Mr. Brown and Councilmember Edens' suggestions of how we could perhaps move forward with education and then revisit this back at the end of October. I think we're still in a position that if we wanted to do it even as early as April or August or November, we may be able to still do that, but at least we could think through this and see what the best approach might be, if that's acceptable to the committee.
Yeah.
And then the follow-up would be in the next couple of weeks, I guess, would be, we've got these 2 subcommittees and I don't want to form any more committees than we need to. But the real question would be, is we've got a large task force and will we be better served to just have an education subcommittee? As we previously did, but just add some folks to Ms. Holthouse's previous subcommittee with the understanding that that'll be education of the public aggressively over the next upcoming year, which may or may not reflect into at least a ballot measure. Any thoughts?
I'd be happy to hop back on the education thing and we can put a poll together and we can start getting a message out in the way that we're allowed to do it. That's not hard to do.
Is everybody in favor of that? Okay. Ms. Arnett, I didn't mean to make your job even more difficult, but can you create a 3rd subcommittee? And we could add Councilmember Farmer and I'm sure Ms. Holthouse and Ms. Donaldson at least to that and see if there's others that would like to participate. I think that would be helpful.
Just email me if you want to be on there. I'm happy to do it. Thank you.
And put Councilmember Garitano on there as well. He's got a huge social media following. And I think it's going to be helpful. And as you're working towards education, it's probably a good thing to get folks like him. He's an influencer, at least in my wildwood. So
we'll add him and he will.
Perfect. Well, if there's no other discussion on this, I believe our last 2 points are going to be our next meeting date is October the 28th. Co-Chair Orchesky, do you have any further comments or are there any other comments from the committee?
I do not have any.
Mr. Vunich.
No, sir, but thank you all for attending tonight. We do appreciate it very much.
Thank you all. A motion to adjourn? Made by Councilmember Farmer, seconded by Councilmember McCutcheon. There's no debate on this. All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed?
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstains? Everyone have a great day and go enjoy the wonderful TV debate that's ongoing.
Thanks, Dan.